St. Petersburg, winter, 1725. The snow fell silently that night, covering the imperial courtyards of Peterhof Palace in a crisp white shroud. Candles flickered behind frost-kissed windows. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings and golden chandeliers, the Tsar's court gathered for yet another feast of excess. And seated between generals, nobles, and foreign envoys were children no taller than a saber, dressed in velvet coats and powdered wigs, faces painted, eyes hollow. They laughed on command. They danced when ordered. They existed, like living dolls, for the twisted amusement of the most powerful empire on earth. They were the court dwarfs of Imperial Russia. But this was no fairy tale. Behind the laughter lay chains. Behind the costumes, centuries of cruelty. Some were stolen from their families. Others were bred like animals. Many died young. And the few who survived learned that silence was their only shield. They were used to mock enemies, amuse Tsars, and humiliate those who fell from grace. And when the throne wobbled, when revolution stirred and blood soaked the snow, it was often these very dwarfs who stood closest to the eye of the storm. Who were they? Why were they there? And how did a tradition so bizarre, so dehumanizing, last for centuries in one of the most powerful monarchies in history? Historians rarely speak of them, but their stories did not vanish. Their names are written in forgotten memoirs. Their portraits, though often unnamed, still hang in the shadows of Russia's grand palaces. And their fate speaks not only of them, but of what happens when power becomes spectacle and people become playthings. This is the story of the court dwarfs of Imperial Russia, a tale of beauty and brutality, laughter and oppression, ceremony and suffering, a hidden world finally brought to light.
Gilded cage, unbroken chain, born to serve, endure the game. Now the mirrors hold no dust and shame, yet through the halls their echoes cry, the ones who lived unseen, denied.
Before the towering palaces, before the powdered wigs, before the whispers behind satin curtains, Russia was still a land carving itself into empire. It was a place of sprawling forests, brutal winters, and isolated principalities that spoke 100 tongues and bowed to 12 princes. But by the 17th century, a new kind of power had emerged, autocracy, gilded and absolute. The Romanovs ruled by divine right. The Tsar was not merely a king, he was the voice of God on earth. And around him swirled a world built to entertain, to glorify, and to obey. But beneath the surface of this glittering imperial court was a system built on spectacle. And in that system, the human body, especially when different, could be weaponized for humor, mockery, and display. The tradition of using individuals with dwarfism as court entertainers was not unique to Russia. It had its roots in ancient civilizations, from Egypt and Rome to medieval France and Spain. In Renaissance Europe, court dwarfs were dressed in exotic garb, given symbolic roles, and made part of elaborate pageants. In many cases, they were mocked as fools, their bodies turned into metaphors for power's cruelty or God's whimsy. But while Western courts often cast dwarfs as jesters or companions, Russia turned the practice into something even more calculated and far more sinister. Long before Peter the Great's modernizing reforms, the Muscovite court had its own peculiar fascination with bodily control. Physical appearances mattered deeply: beards, dress, posture, all governed by strict social codes tied to religion and hierarchy. By the late 1500s, records show that Tsar Ivan the Terrible himself kept court dwarfs, not only as comic relief but as brutal reminders of his unpredictable authority. They were brought to feasts, made to perform absurd rituals, and, on occasion, used to humiliate those the Tsar had fallen out with. Russia's obsession with control. As Russia transitioned from a medieval theocracy to a centralized autocracy, the control of the body became a symbol of the control of the nation. This obsession found strange expression in its treatment of the differently abled. Dwarfs were not just tolerated, they were captured, displayed, and arranged. Some were gifted to the Tsar by foreign rulers, traded like ornaments. Others were found among the peasantry and forcibly taken from their homes. Russian nobles, emulating the crown, began maintaining their own collections of dwarfs for private entertainment. It wasn't only a show of wealth. It was a show of domination. The Romanovs and the theatrical court. With the rise of the Romanov dynasty in the early 1600s, the imperial court took spectacle to new heights. Inspired by Baroque Europe and driven by a hunger to legitimize their rule, the Romanovs built a world of drama, opulence, and ritual. Peter the Great, one of the most iconic and controversial Tsars, transformed the imperial court into a stage where every person, gesture, and uniform was curated to send a message. It was under Peter's reign that the use of court dwarfs became systematized. And it was no longer just comedy. It became theater, satire, punishment. Peter created entire performances in which dwarfs acted out political allegories, mocked religious conservatives, or reenacted humiliating parodies of court life. Some were even married off in grand mock weddings, events attended by high-ranking nobles who were forced to laugh, clap, and drink through the grotesque charade. To disobey, to refuse, to pity, was to insult the Tsar himself. A world of two courts. At the heart of this world were two realities. One, the official world of Imperial Russia, lavish, orderly, enlightened. The other, the hidden world of those beneath the gold and marble, servants, concubines, prisoners, and dwarfs. They were often locked away from public view except when summoned. Many lived under forced servitude. A few rose to favor, but even then, their lives remained precarious. One wrong move, one change in favor, and they were discarded. This contradiction between glorified progress and medieval cruelty defined Russia's imperial age. And no group embodied that paradox more tragically than the court dwarfs. While the West moved toward enlightenment, embracing science and individual dignity, Russia remained entangled in contradictions. Tsars sent ships to explore the Arctic, reformed schools, and built cities on swamps, while simultaneously orchestrating public mock weddings between dwarfs for political satire. In the Ottoman Empire, harem dwarfs served as trusted eunuchs. In Persia, court jesters mocked the Shah. But in Russia, dwarfs became both pawns and symbols, used not just to entertain, but to reinforce hierarchy and humiliate dissent. This wasn't just about difference. It was about control. Fear that the throne was never as stable as it seemed. That power, like the court's laughter, could vanish in an instant. Certainly. Here's the revised Section 3. Unfold the conflict, rise, tensions, or progress with the numbered subheadings removed and replaced with smooth narrative transitions for a more cinematic flow. A velvet curtain rises in the Winter Palace ballroom. Candles burn low. Nobles in powdered wigs murmur and sip from crystal goblets. Then music swells. Two dwarfs, dressed in full imperial regalia, step forward to be wed under a painted arch of roses. The audience roars with laughter. But behind that laughter, something darker stirs. This was no ordinary celebration. It was a performance, orchestrated by Tsar Peter the Great himself. And it was only one act in a decades-long spectacle of domination masked as festivity. Peter the Great, architect of modern Russia, brought enlightenment, war, and empire in equal measure. He opened ports, cut noblemen's beards, built the navy from scratch, and demanded loyalty at every level of the state. But to secure that loyalty, Peter turned the court into a theater. A place where hierarchy was not only enforced, it was humiliated into existence. And dwarfs became central props in this performance of power. Peter detested the old Muscovite elite. They clung to beards, old rites, and orthodox traditions. He mocked their conservatism with savage brilliance. In one infamous spectacle, he staged a mock Orthodox wedding, complete with cardinals, choirs, and a dwarf pope at the altar. The dwarf's lisping sermon drew laughter, but the real target was Russia's priesthood. And in 1710, Peter commanded a grand wedding between two court dwarfs, Yakov Fedorov and Maria Dorofeeva. It was staged in full imperial grandeur. Nobles were ordered to attend. Foreign ambassadors looked on in shock. The dwarfs, dressed in miniature replicas of royal robes, were paraded like children in a puppet show. But behind the satin and lace, Yakov Fedorov's eyes betrayed the truth: this was not a celebration. It was a command performance, and refusal was not an option. As the court's appetite for amusement grew, so did the machinery to supply it. Dwarfs were no longer just found, they were sourced. Some were purchased from foreign traders. Others were identified in Russian villages, seized from peasant families, and delivered to court as gifts or tributes. Whispers speak of agents sent into the provinces specifically to find suitable specimens, those with distinctive appearances, voices, or deformities. A few were born within the court's own ranks, to dwarf parents arranged to marry. There is evidence, scattered in private letters, that certain nobles attempted to breed court dwarfs, pairing individuals to produce more court-worthy offspring. Whether myth or fact, it underscores the inhuman lens through which these people were seen, not as subjects, but as curiosities to be curated. Worse still, dwarfs who displeased their masters could be discarded, or worse, punished. Some memoirs recount dwarf entertainers whipped for speaking out of turn. Others were locked away in palace cellars for months, fed only bread and water. One dwarf, named Pavel, once a favorite of Empress Anna, fell from favor and was forced to live in a kennel beneath her stables. He died in obscurity. After Peter's death, the court continued its grotesque fascination under his niece, Empress Anna Ivanovna, a ruler with a taste for cruelty as sharp as her diamonds. Anna is infamous for one of the most chilling displays in imperial history. In 1740, she arranged the forced marriage of her ex-lover, Prince Mikhail Golitsyn, to a Kalmyk dwarf woman named Avdotya Butsuninova. The reason? Golitsyn had angered her by marrying without permission. As punishment, Anna nullified his marriage and orchestrated the most humiliating revenge imaginable. She built a life-sized ice palace in St. Petersburg's bitter winter. Inside, the dwarf wedding was held, complete with icy furniture, frozen cutlery, and a full cast of dwarf attendants. Golitsyn and Avdotia were ordered to sleep in an ice bed, under guard, or risk death. It was a spectacle soaked in mockery and revenge. Hundreds of nobles were forced to attend and laugh. Avdotia wept throughout. Golitsyn shivered in silence. The morning after, frostbite had set in. They survived, but never spoke publicly again. To the outside world, court dwarfs were symbols of whimsy. But within palace walls, they lived double lives, torn between spectacle and survival. Many were trained in performance. They learned French, German, ballet, and music. A few became confidants to the imperial children. Some wielded quiet influence in palace intrigue. But they could never escape their role. They were not nobles. They were not serfs. They were ornaments of the court, without formal rights, always at the mercy of imperial favor. Dwarfs were assigned separate living quarters, away from other servants. They were given costumes, often gaudy or miniature uniforms. Their lives were tightly controlled. They were expected to entertain, remain cheerful, and never question the conditions they lived in. But diaries reveal another side. In one entry, a court physician noted, "These little ones laugh for the empress, but I see them weep in the garden shadows." And not all dwarfs remained silent. In the waning days of Empress Elizabeth's reign, a quiet resistance stirred. Several dwarfs who served in the palace kitchen began refusing to perform during imperial dinners. One named Vasily, well liked by visiting nobles, simply refused to don his costume. When summoned, he replied, "I am not a jester. I am a man." He was beaten and banished to a rural estate. But his defiance echoed through the court. A few years later, another dwarf named Doria, known for her musical gifts, left the palace and vanished. Rumors swirled that she'd joined a traveling Romani troupe. Others claimed she fled to a convent, where she lived in silence. Their stories may have ended in obscurity, but their quiet resistance carved cracks in the golden facade of Russian spectacle. As the 18th century wore on, Russia faced wars, reforms, and revolutions of its own. The Napoleonic threat, internal rebellions, and peasant unrest made even the gilded walls of court tremble. And with each shockwave, the court's need for control and distraction grew. Some Tsars, like Catherine the Great, began to frown upon the practice. A woman of enlightenment thought she found the use of court dwarfs vulgar, even barbaric. Still, she did not abolish the tradition outright. Dwarfs remained in the palace, though fewer were showcased. They were quietly reassigned to backroom roles, librarians, attendants, tutors to imperial children. By the mid-19th century, as revolution swept Europe and Russia modernized under pressure, the age of dwarf spectacle began to wane. But its legacy, its cruelty, its beauty, its contradictions, had already been carved into the marble halls of empire. The conflict was not simply between dwarf and Tsar. It was a battle between personhood and performance, between dignity and dehumanization, between power and the silent victims beneath its feet. And even as the palace lights dimmed, the memory of the laughter, forced, hollow, echoing, remained. February 1917. Snow smothers the streets of Petrograd. Armed workers storm the Tauride Palace. A soldier rips a Tsarist portrait from the wall. Another smashes a crystal goblet beneath his boot. Somewhere in the Winter Palace, a hallway long sealed to the public reveals forgotten quarters, dusty, locked behind gilded doors. In one room, tiny shoes, a faded uniform, a crumbling portrait of a man barely 3 feet tall in full ceremonial dress. No name. No records. Only silence. The Russian Empire was falling. And with it, the hidden world of court dwarfs vanished, erased, or destroyed by the fires of revolution. By the dawn of the 20th century, Imperial Russia was a nation teetering on the edge of implosion. The cracks in the system had widened, the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War, the chaos of 1905, the deepening divide between nobility and peasantry. Factories suffocated cities with soot. Crops failed. Strikes paralyzed industry. Revolutionary pamphlets circulated like poison. The Romanovs clung to ritual as if it could anchor a sinking ship. Within those rituals, awkward and increasingly out of place, remained the last whispers of the dwarf tradition. Gone were the mock weddings and public parades. The dwarfs who remained in the imperial orbit were old, frail shadows of a fading court. Some shuffled through palace hallways as aging attendants or ceremonial relics, barely acknowledged. They were no longer spectacle. They were remnants. Curiosities the empire had outgrown but never quite released. They were ghosts of a bygone pageant, and their presence, mute, uneasy, unresolved, reminded everyone of a cruelty now too absurd to justify. Then came the war. World War I devoured men, money, and meaning. Millions were conscripted. Frontlines dissolved. Tsar Nicholas II took personal command of the army and left his wife Alexandra under the spell of the monk Rasputin. The streets of Petrograd starved while banquets continued in the palace. The gap between the court and the people became a chasm. In early 1917, the flood broke. Mutinies ignited. Protesters flooded the capital. The Tsar abdicated. The palaces fell like dominoes, stormed, looted, stripped of their illusions. Private quarters were open to the public. Gilded bedrooms became barracks. Throne rooms were ransacked. And hidden behind sealed doors and unused hallways, the last court dwarfs disappeared. Some were executed in the chaos, seen as symbols of decadence and imperial corruption. Others fled into the countryside, into convents, into oblivion. A few tried to remain, hoping the new order would find a place for them. But the Bolsheviks, obsessed with purity of ideology, had no tolerance for imperial oddities. They were not reabsorbed. They were erased. One name that surfaces in the fog of revolution is Mikhail Krasnov. He had served Grand Duchess Xenia as a private attendant and appeared in several imperial photographs. After the fall, he vanished. Some claimed he escaped to Crimea and boarded a British vessel. Others say he was executed during the Red Terror. His body was never found. His name appears only once, in a British intelligence memo, listed simply as small-statured man, unknown role. Another figure, Lena Gerasimova, had once performed music for the Empress Dowager. In the final months of the monarchy, she was seen crying outside Peterhof as Red Guards ransacked the palace. Her name disappears from all records after that night. The new Soviet regime had no interest in preserving such memories. There were no monuments. No biographies. No mention in school books. They were relics of a system built on humiliation, turned to ash by revolution. Under Lenin, the focus remained on political survival. Under Stalin, the past became dangerous. Everything associated with the Romanovs was purged. Any trace of spectacle, pageantry, or class hierarchy was dismantled, and that included court dwarfs. They were not martyrs. They were not even recognized as victims. They were simply expunged. In the 1930s, during the Great Purge, secret police reports occasionally mention former palace personnel arrested for counter-revolutionary connections. One file describes the interrogation of a woman of non-standard stature living in a monastery near Kazan, accused of hiding Tsarist relics. She was never released. Her name was not recorded. Just her height. As the decades passed, even the stories of the dwarf's suffering were forgotten. The few paintings that survive hang in minor galleries, their subjects unnamed. A handful of archival orders, summoning dwarfs to court, assigning them wages, instructing them to dress for imperial weddings, exist only as yellowed pages in locked collections. In the Hermitage, a portrait remains of a man, barely waist height, dressed in a miniature naval uniform, his expression frozen between dignity and despair. Tourists pass it daily. Few stop to wonder who he was. The Soviet era rewrote the past in steel and stone, and there was no room for the soft, strange echoes of those who once danced on command. And yet, even in silence, the truth lingers. The dwarf tradition did not end because it was wrong. It ended because it became inconvenient. Because the machinery of state no longer needed it. And so it vanished, as it had existed, without consent, without recognition, without justice. The empire collapsed. The throne fell. The world changed. But the names, the voices, the pain, they were buried under revolution, like so many others the system used and discarded. The question that remains is not how such a tradition endured for so long. It is why it was so easily forgotten. The palaces stood. But the people were gone. After the Russian Revolution and the civil war that followed, a new world was constructed over the ashes of the old. The Tsars were replaced by commissars. Gilded halls became museums or military headquarters. Orthodox crosses were torn from domes. And everything connected to the Romanovs, luxury, mysticism, ritual, was quietly removed, repurposed, or destroyed. Among the many traditions erased was the institution of court dwarfs. No official decree outlawed it. No monument marked its demise. It simply disappeared, absorbed into the great forgetting. What followed was not a reckoning, but a silence. In the Soviet imagination, there was no place for such an ugly truth. Dwarfs at court, bred, paraded, punished, were a symbol of everything the USSR stood against: the grotesque spectacle of monarchy, the humiliation of the weak, the weaponization of the body for laughter and control. Soviet textbooks denounced the Romanovs as tyrants and parasites, but they omitted the twisted theater of the dwarfs. It was too disturbing. Too absurd. Too telling. So, it was deleted. The remaining records, letters, inventories, portraits, were locked in sealed archives, dismissed as irrelevant or too sensitive for release. Only the stray visitor to a provincial museum or the careful reader of Tsarist-era memoirs might catch a reference: a dwarf who served tea to the Grand Duchess, another who once conducted a private orchestra of children. Even among dissident historians, the subject was taboo. It was not until the late 1980s, in the twilight of the Soviet Union, that independent researchers began quietly rediscovering the fragments. A few obscure papers were published in historical journals. Archival files were unsealed, revealing palace payrolls listing the names and wages of dwarfs as court employees. Private. And what we remember now, through fragments, portraits, and the whispers of forgotten rooms, is not just what happened to them. It's what their lives reveal about us. Their story forces a reckoning with the ugliness beneath grandeur. It shows how power, when unchecked, does not merely demand obedience, it demands performance. It forces people to dance, laugh, bow, and bleed for its pleasure. It decorates cruelty with costumes. It silences protest with applause. And it often begins where the audience sees no harm. What was the harm in a wedding between two dwarfs? What was the harm in laughter? What was the harm in a doll-sized uniform or a painted face? The harm was in the lie that this was joy, not servitude. That this was inclusion, not erasure. That this was tradition, not oppression. Today, the world has changed, but not entirely. We still live in societies that commodify difference. That use bodies as symbols, that reduce people to spectacle. That confuse representation with permission. That ask the marginalized to smile, to entertain, to be grateful for visibility without ever granting true dignity. The dwarfs of the Russian court were never given justice. But remembering them, truthfully, fully, without ornament or apology, is a form of moral restoration. Their legacy is not in the palaces they once lived in, but in the questions they force us to ask. When does visibility become exploitation? What is the price of silence in systems built on showmanship? And how do we make room for the voices history erased? In the end, theirs is not a story of small people. It's a story of a small place inside every empire, where cruelty is normalized, where difference is displayed, and where entertainment disguises oppression. That place still exists. And it must be confronted. Because until we do, we will continue to build golden stages on the backs of those forced to kneel upon them.